All right. In three, two, one. Hello, and welcome to Know the Score. I'm your host, Don Delarente. And on this episode, I'm joined by one of the co hosts of 2.1 Seconds to Madness, none other than Russell Hangline himself. What's going on, Russ?
Hey man, just trying to watch some basketball today. Big day today.
Yes.
Lots of basketball.
Yes, we're recording this on Thursday, which is the start of all the top four seeds getting started in the major conferences. So 24 hours of basketball, basically, if you want to watch it today. So please indulge in this weekend and next week as well, because it's going to be the same thing starting next Thursday and Friday as well. But I've got Russ here to first talk about and catch up with him, how he's been this year. You and K-Bass, unfortunately, couldn't, give us the weekly content that you have been providing for the last couple of years on college basketball. So just kind of, catch people up with how you feeling about the season, the ups and downs of your own team personally, and just overall the state of college basketball.
Oh man, it's been a great year. A lot of parity in terms of the sport. I've been good too. For those who listened to my podcast, so I'm a writer, and I've also launched a website with my wife, The Beer Travel Guide. So we've had a lot on our plate. My co-host has had a lot on his plate as well. So everything's fine. Everything's actually great. That's why it's been so hard to do the podcast because like so much stuff in real life is going on. In terms of the sport itself, I mean, I think it's been a really great year. A lot of parity, I feel like. Maybe not as much at the top, but like beyond that, I think maybe there's only about like 6 teams at most, I would say, are possible title contenders. So, but then again, that feels right, generally speaking. Yeah, but like, Kansas obviously losing the Big 12. Great story, big story. Kentucky, Tennessee, and LSU in the SEC really duking it out. Obviously, Duke, UNC, and Virginia duking it out, no pun intended, in the ACC. The Big Ten having its own stuff going on with Michigan, Michigan State. Even though Michigan State's hurt, they still go on and win the Big Ten. Purdue somehow getting the share of the title. So, yeah, just a lot of competition this year. Really, really interesting stuff, and a lot of really good mid-major teams this year as well, including a couple that will actually probably get at-large bids if they don't win their conference tournament. I know that Wofford is one of those teams that will almost certainly get an at-large bid, which is really exciting to see as well. A lot of fans of the sport obviously want to see more mid-majors get into the tournament, sort of what makes the tournament really special. We obviously saw that with Loyola last year making its run. And we want to see more of that. I don't know about you. I'm sick of seeing Syracuse limp in with 14 losses. I'd rather see some really good mid-major come in. So, yeah. So I think the sport is great. In terms of my team is Duke. As listeners of my show know, it's been a great year. Would have loved full health. Obviously, for the rivalry games, would have loved full health. It's really ridiculous that to date, UNC somehow between Kyrie Irving, Harry Giles, and Zion Williamson only got to play 16 minutes against the 3 of them combined. That's just, par for the course, I guess. But, like, hopefully there will be a rematch on Friday with Zion. I think that is a great matchup that favors Duke in a lot of ways when Zion is on the court. Just because Duke really doesn't have anybody for Luke May if Zion is not there. But if Zion is there, then Luke May has very little that he can do, I think. So I just think that's a huge, huge chess piece to remove from the board in that matchup. So hopefully we'll see that on Friday. But it's been a great year. Otherwise, it's been a lot of fun to watch. I got to go to Cameron and see Duke play this year, which is really exciting. And yeah, I think if they can remain healthy, big if, then they have a very, very good chance at the title. So again, that's all really you ever want as a fan, is to have your team be one of the few teams that's in title contention. So feels good.
All right. So we'll get into talking about these conference tournaments, and we'll start with the granddaddy of them all, the ACC. As you mentioned, Virginia is going to come into this year's tournament as the top seed, with North Carolina as the second seed, Duke is the third seed, and Florida State as the fourth seed. So I just kind of want you to handicap each team's chances of coming out victorious in this year's ACC tournament out of those top 4 teams.
Oh man, who was the fourth again? Florida. I mean, it doesn't matter. Okay, so there's only 3. Obviously, it's Virginia, UNC, and Duke. I think that if Duke is healthy, if Zion is the way that he is, then I think that Duke has a really good chance of getting back to Virginia, playing them for a third time. It's obviously very, very hard to beat a team 3 times, especially a team that has been as terrific as Virginia all year long. That having been said, one of the things that has made this year really special for Duke fans is that Zion Williamson and R.J. Barrett, they want the big moment. They want it. They don't shy away from the spotlight. We've had a couple of freshmen who are very talented in recent years who, just maybe aren't really built for that moment, who don't really embrace it as much, or who seem to play with nerves, and those 2 guys don't. So, I mean, I'd say if I'm setting the line, let's say Duke's got a harder path than Virginia. I guess you got to consider that as well. But I also think, Louisville and UNC is going to be a really interesting game today, I think, because, I know that you're a UNC fan. You recall that Louisville really beat the hell out of them at the Dean Dome earlier this year. There's clearly enough size on Louisville to deal with UNC, and I think they have the hardest matchup today. So I think UNC's path would easily be the hardest. I'm going to put their odds lowest. Obviously not lower than FSU, but out of the 3 realistic contenders. Obviously, if UNC loses to Louisville, then you increase Duke's odds of winning the ACC tournament. But I think it'd be hard for me to say. I don't want to discount Virginia just because they lost twice to Duke already. Virginia's really, really playing out of their minds. They've played out of their minds all year with the exception of the Duke games. So I'd say a pretty coin flip between Virginia and Duke, honestly. Again, assuming that Zion is 100% healthy, which it seems like he is. Duke may miss Bolden in the Virginia game just because he's good against that big guy Jack Salt that they have. They like to play sort of a big rim guy like that. So they may miss Bolden there. I don't know. That's such a coin flip for me. It's really hard for me to say one way or another. Vegas would tell you Virginia is the favorite.
All right. Yeah, Carolina's matchup today against Louisville, when I saw that, I kind of cringed a little bit just because Louisville's outside shooting can definitely give Carolina a problem, which was the recipe for the 20-point win back in, I think that was early January, late January, early February. So, yeah, Carolina's going to definitely have to guard the perimeter against Louisville to try to make them a 2-point shooting team, and then hope that they're making their own 3-point shots in return to kind of balance the things out, because Carolina's not really that strong on the inside, and it kind of showed at the end of the Duke game on Saturday, where they have this 12-point lead. They're trying to knock Duke out, and they keep shooting these threes with 4 minutes to go. Like, what are y'all doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's also just the game today, isn't it? Right? Like, certainly Duke has lost its games like that by just settling for bad threes. The analytics obviously would state that the 3-pointer is a better shot than the contested 2, that, like, unless you can get a layup, the 3-pointer is the best shot. And I think teams are maybe overcorrecting a little bit on that, and tossing up too many that are contested or early in the shot clock or things like this. I'll say between UNC and Louisville, the difference is going to be the rebounding. I mean, because obviously UNC did beat Louisville at Louisville, and in that game they had a 49-32 rebounding advantage. I mean, that's massive. Louisville shot the 3 really well at Louisville also. It's just that if you don't get a single board, if your rebounding margin is -17, you're probably going to lose the game. Whereas at the Dean Dome, Louisville had the rebounding advantage 40-31. It's who wins the boards. It'll just be who wins the boards. I think UNC's been doing a really good job on the glass as of late. But Yeah, I mean Louisville's just sneaky, man, and they're really well coached. I think Chris Mack is a great coach. I know they had that big fall apart against Duke, and people have been razzing them a little bit for some of those late game problems, but they're such an untalented team. They're so relatively untalented for what we expect from Louisville. There's maybe one pro player on that team at most, whereas like UNC's got what? I mean, at least 3, probably 4. Obviously, Duke has at least 4. So, I mean, the fact that Louisville has been as competitive as they have been with this roster is really a testament to Chris Mack's coaching ability. So it'll be interesting to see what happens today.
Before we move away from the ACC, talk about some teams at the back end of the bubble for the ACC. I think they're projected to maybe get as many as 7 if everything works out. The bubble teams that are on the bubble make it. So NC State, they got a win yesterday against Clemson. Come from behind. They didn't have a great first half, held Clemson to 16 points in the second half. May have got a charity foul call, 2 free throws, and they win by 1. Talk about the bubble in the ACC. Who do you think's going to get in and who do you think is going to get bounced out?
Well, I mean, Syracuse is in. If they lose today, which again, I think they probably will, they're not going to have Tyus battle for the game today. So I think that's a pretty excusable loss. I think they're going to be right around the 9 seed, maybe the 10 seed line. I'd be really surprised if they dropped off. Obviously, beating Duke at Duke is just such a huge resume builder, even though Duke was down nearly half of their starting lineup. I mean, at the end of the day, on paper, that's still going to be a great-looking win. NC State and Clemson are both really terrible. They're just bad. I'd love to see neither of them get in. Now, granted, as we're recording this, NC State is beating Virginia at the half. I don't expect that to sustain. I obviously expect Virginia to win this game. Clemson is, in my opinion, out. I can't imagine a world in which Clemson gets in. Clemson right now, their net is 35, which is pretty good, but I mean, they are 1-10 against quadrant 1 teams, 6-3 against quadrant 2. So like a 7-13 between quadrant 1 and 2 with only 1 quad 1 win. I don't think that's good enough. And then NC State, I mean, if they win today, they're obviously in. But NC State also 3-9 against the net quad 1. They're obviously 33rd in the net, which you'd think would get a team in. And they've been making this point on TV a lot, and I think it's a good one. NC State has the worst non-conference strength of schedule in the country, period, out of all teams. And I forget who it was on TV yesterday. It might have been LaFonso Ellis. It was somebody who was like, do you know how hard it is to have the worst non-conference strength of schedule? Like, you don't accidentally have the worst non-conference strength of schedule. Like, you plan on having the worst non-conference strength of schedule. I mean, you look up and down, and it's absolutely abysmal. I mean, they've got a couple like good games there, but I mean, the start of their season, people made fun of Georgetown all the time last year for playing a bunch of teams that were like sub 300 in KenPom. I mean, Mount St. Mary's, Maryland Eastern Shore, Maine, St. Peter's, USC Upstate. I mean, they might as well have just been playing in the SWAC. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous. So I wouldn't be surprised if the committee makes an example of them and says, look, we don't like when teams don't challenge themselves outside of the conference. We just don't like it. They've held St. Mary's out in the past for that exact thing. And again, they have a scarcity of big wins. I mean, they've got Auburn at home. I mean, which is a decent win, but that 9-9 in conference or whatever they are, 9-9 in conference. That's no wins against the top half of the conference, 0, right? So I've got to think that they're out if they don't win today. I would hope that they're out. I would much rather see a mid-major play than terrible NC State.
The other team that should be comfortably in would be Virginia Tech, you think, right?
Oh yeah, I mean they're like a top 5 seed. They're gonna get a really high seed. They're great.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and Louisville will be like in the middle of that pack as well. They'll be like 6, 7, somewhere in there.
Okay, so we're gonna move from the ACC over to the Big Ten. where, like you said, Michigan State and Purdue, they shared the regular season title. They're going to be the top 2 seeds. We're going to have Michigan as a 3rd seed, and Wisconsin, with a disappointing end to the season, is going to be the 4th seed. So again, like we did with the ACC, kind of handicap those top 4 seeds. Who do you think is going to be victorious this weekend coming out of the Big Ten?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of storylines here, right? I think Wisconsin is better than people expected them to be. People did not expect last year they were not very good, but they had a lot of injuries. This year they brought I want to say Khalil Iverson was hurt last year. Maybe Trice had some injury problems, but they were young and they were beat up. So this year people came in expecting them to be sort of a middle of the pack team. I've been really high on Wisconsin all year. I think Wisconsin is really, really good. I think they're underrated as a team sort of on the national sort of circuit in general. Right now I think they'd be on the 4 or 5 line in the NCAA tournament when really they're as strong as about a 3 seed. So if you're a 1 seed, you really don't want to be drawing a team like Wisconsin, not with their experience, not with Happ in there. Yeah, this is going to be an interesting tournament. I don't really know who I love because I think Michigan State, the 1 seed, they may be getting Nick Ward back, which would definitely be big for them. But they've got to face a hot Indiana team, realistically, right? So that's already going to be by far, in my opinion, the hardest entry-level game, except maybe Maryland playing Wisconsin, presumably. You got to like Purdue and Michigan down at the bottom there for having an easier path to the thing. Because, I mean, Michigan State, in order to make the finals, has to beat Indiana and then beat the winner of Wisconsin or Maryland. And especially if it's Wisconsin, I mean, that's a brutal 1-2 punch of teams, I would think. So then you got to deal with Michigan versus Purdue. Michigan really beat the brakes off of Purdue early this year. Purdue and Michigan both, honestly, have benefited some from an easier schedule in the conference. But make no mistake, Michigan, I think, is really good. I think that Michigan is sort of underrated as a title contender. I mean, people forget, just how well they've done the last couple of years and how they've really transformed themselves from an offensive-minded team into a defensive-minded team. They got a lot of experience. They got a lot of shooters. So if you were asking me to bet, I would go with Michigan here. I just don't know that Purdue, since they're very reliant on Carson Edwards, and I think Xavier Simpson is a good enough defender to lock him up. I like Michigan over Purdue in that matchup. And then, again, presumably you've got Michigan versus Michigan State there. Obviously, in the regular season, Michigan State got the best of Michigan, so that would certainly sort of suggest that Michigan State would be better. But as I said about Duke and Virginia, it's really hard to beat a team 3 times, especially when both teams are really, really good. And because Michigan State's path is just going to be a lot harder, in my opinion, if they have to play Indiana and then follow it with Wisconsin. Then, yeah, I like Michigan to win the Big Ten tournament. I will say Maryland is probably the sneaky team here. I've given Maryland a lot of crap over the years for, just being bad, for being not very good in general. And again, they've sort of struggled with the upper tier of the Big Ten as well. I mean, what are they? There's something like 2-5, 2-6 against those top 4 seeds. But when you've got a team with big men like that, and they've got Jalen Smith and Bruno Fernando, that's certainly a pair of players that gave Ethan Happ trouble during the regular season. If you give Ethan Happ trouble, then you give Wisconsin trouble. Then they sneak by. Maybe they can play against Michigan State at that point. Again, I wouldn't be optimistic that Maryland would beat Michigan State, but they've just got a lot of talent on their team, and I think that's really hard to dismiss. But I think if Maryland beat Wisconsin and then Maryland is playing Michigan State, then that's when I would place my bet for who would win it all. And then I probably would bet on Michigan State at that point.
Talk about the bubble teams in the Big Ten. Who do you think is going to make it and who's going to get bounced off?
I think Iowa's probably in. They'll be like an 8-9 seed. I think they're pretty comfortably in. Ohio State's got to win. They're playing right now, I believe. I don't know what the score is. They got to beat Indiana. I can't imagine that they feel safe without it. Maybe they played later today. That must be it. Or no, maybe that's just the ranked teams. All right, I'm going to pull that up while I'm talking. I think Ohio State's got to win in order to be in order to sniff that. I do not believe Indiana should be in. I mean, obviously, if they lost today, then they're definitely out. But in particular, just you can't have that many losses, man. I mean, and they got bad losses. Like, so OSU is up on Indiana 7.5 right now. I think it's a must-win for both teams. I think the loser, I'd be surprised if they make it. I think they should be out, whoever the loser is. And I think both teams probably need to beat Michigan State to feel really good. Yeah, I just wouldn't really bet on either of them getting in. I mean, what's the net situation here with either of them? Ohio State 54th in the net. They've got some good wins, but they've got a quad 3 loss. Indiana's got 6 big wins, which obviously is really good, but I mean they're 8-15 against quad 1 and 2, and they've got 14 losses. They'll almost certainly end the season with 15 losses. And how are you going to make the tournament with 15 losses, dude? You know, like how are you going to get in with like at best like an 18-15 record realistically? I just can't imagine that. If they hadn't swept Michigan State, then I don't even think this is a conversation. Like I think they're an obvious NIT team. So I don't think they should get in. I think they're bad. Minnesota is probably on the right side of things. I think they're sort of an interesting case. 56 in the net is obviously not very good, but they've got like they're 9-12. That's a little closer to 500 against the quad 1, quad 2. They got a couple of big wins. And they've also just got a bit of an easier path to collect some wins here, if I recall correctly. I mean, they got Penn State today. They've got Purdue, assuming they win today. I don't remember off the top how they did against Purdue during the regular season, but they lost at Purdue. But then they beat Purdue at home, so I mean, maybe that's an interesting game. I think you got to beat Purdue to feel really safe, but I think ultimately, if like all these teams lose, Minnesota's probably in. Indiana and Ohio State, hopefully out.
This is Know the Score. I'm your host, Don Delarente, and I'm joined by my special guest, Russell Hangline of the 2.1 Seconds to Madness podcast, and we're talking about the conference tournaments and the upcoming NCAA tournament as well. So we'll shift over to the SEC. This was a fun league this year where LSU survived, and they came out with the number 1 seed for this year's tournament, followed by Kentucky, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Now, LSU's had some controversy with their coach the last couple of weeks, so they have a big distraction headed into March and these conference tournaments and the NCAA tournament. So, Russ, who's your favorite to win the SEC this weekend?
Well, I mean, you've got to assume that Will Wade is not coaching. So if he's not coaching, then yeah, you got to assume that LSU you can just sort of rule out. Kentucky and Tennessee are the obvious favorites here. I also like Auburn a lot, and frankly, you look at who Auburn's got lined up. They've got Missouri today. If they win, they've got South Carolina, a super weak force. I mean, like, South Carolina is not realistically an NCAA tournament team unless they win the SEC tournament. So they're really weak. That helps. Then they could get an LSU team that's down to Javonte Smart, is down their coach. I mean, you've got to sort of like their chances to sneak into the SEC title game. I like that to happen, frankly. Kentucky and Tennessee, both teams really good, both title contenders. These are sort of the really interesting these are the interesting matchups here. Tennessee, I think, has a bit of a harder path, one could argue. They're playing, Mississippi State realistically is their hardest option there. I don't think Texas A&M is going to do anything. So Tennessee, Mississippi State, although Tennessee beat Mississippi State, so maybe that's not a problem. Ole Miss, Alabama for Kentucky. Again, I really don't see many problems there. Kentucky, like Duke, can sometimes sleep through a first half because they're so talented, and then that can really bite them in the ass. It's done so a couple of times this year. So, I mean, I guess there's a possibility that could go down. Obviously, Kentucky lost to Alabama earlier this year, nearly lost to Ole Miss, both on the road, though. I just like Kentucky and Tennessee to rematch. If you asked me gun to head which team is better on a neutral court like this, I mean, you got to go, man.
Let me ask you a question, and this will decide it. Who do you trust more in a high-pressure game, Rick Barnes or John Calipari?
I think Rick Barnes is great. I like Rick Barnes got a bad reputation at Texas, but he's also the best coach in the history of Texas basketball. Like, he is the most accomplished coach by far of a university that really has no history of basketball success. I mean, we're seeing what's happening to Shaka Smart right now too. Like, they're always able to get a couple of decent recruits, but there's just no history of basketball success. I mean, that's a big sort of monkey to get off the back. Tennessee has done decently over the years. Kentucky obviously has way better history than Tennessee, that goes without saying, but I don't mistrust Rick Barnes in a big game, really. Especially with this team, he's done so well. The question really becomes Tennessee 13-4 against squad 1 and 2. Kentucky 15-5. Kentucky's in a little better against tougher opponents. And so you sort of have to wonder about that. PJ Washington has been playing out of his mind lately, but Grant Williams, player of the year. It's going to come down to, do you pick experience or do you pick talent? I generally lean talent personally. But obviously this time of year, it's really, really tough to say. Kentucky should get Reed Travis back, though, I would think, for that game. And he's just really important to what they do down low. So gun to head, I'm taking Kentucky. But if Tennessee won by 10-12 also, I'd sort of be like, okay, that makes sense. That's just like Duke. That's such a coin flip. Like Duke, Virginia, just a real coin flip scenario, in my opinion, because just both teams are so different, but also really good. So anything can happen.
All right. The bubble in the SEC, who do you see as teams to watch out for that are going to make it, and who's going to be sad on Sunday when the announcements come out?
Yeah, I mean, Mississippi State and Auburn are both really safe. Auburn is honestly – so this is going to ruin a take that I've been giving people because I think Auburn will make the SEC title game if Will Wade continues to be out here. I think Auburn is grossly underrated as a Cinderella Elite Eight Final Four type of team. They right now are projected at about a 6 seed, but I think KenPom has them at the strength of a high 4 seed. I mean, they're going to be grossly underseeded for how good they are. They're just so dangerous, especially when they're on. They're really, really hard to beat. So granted, if they go to the SEC title game, they're gonna become a 4 seed or a 5 seed. But that's definitely a 4 seed or 5 seed that's capable of beating a 1 seed, in my opinion. They hung in there with Duke pretty well earlier this year. In terms of bubble teams, I mean, Ole Miss is pretty safely in. I think Florida is really the only team realistically on the bubble for the SEC. I don't really see a scenario in which Alabama gets in unless they beat Kentucky. I don't really know what Florida would have to do to get in. They've got a pretty good shot at beating LSU. I mean, that would help even with LSU's problems. Florida's 32nd in. They're 32nd in the net. They've got some pretty good wins, 7-3 12 against quad 1 and 2, 3 wins. I mean, they smell like a tournament team to me, frankly. I think they probably belong in, but again, this is another team that's probably going to have 15 losses. I mean, like, how do you take a team with 15 losses into the NCAA tournament? I mean, if they beat Arkansas, they beat LSU, then at least they're like at 19 and 15. They'll have beaten LSU multiple times. Man, but now that I'm looking at their resume, I don't like them either. These teams are just bad, Don. That's the problem. Whenever we talk about bubble teams, we're talking about bad teams. We're talking about teams that are like mediocre at best, who can't close games, who have maybe talent but wild inefficiency. Meanwhile, you've got so many teams that are going to be on the outside. This is my soapbox section of this. You've got Belmont that belongs in the tournament, in my opinion. You've got Lipscomb, who belongs in the tournament. You've just got these teams that so hardcore belong and that would be so much more interesting to watch. I mean, it'd be so much better to see Hofstra in the NCAA tournament, to watch Justin Foreman-Wright go up against players than it would for any of the, like, who do you want to see on Florida play? Do you want to see Jalen Hudson take the worst 3-point shots you've ever seen in your whole damn life? I mean, do you want to see Alabama run that like muck garbage offense? I mean, like, what do people want there? I mean, it's ridiculous. So I don't know, man. Like, I just can't see any of these teams getting in. I'd so much rather see a scenario in which, you know how they do like the first 4 games in Dayton, right? You know how they do those? Make all of those games play-in games for mid-major teams. That's what I think they should do. If you're Kansas State or if you're Syracuse or whatever, you should not be allowed to play a play-in game. If you're that bad, you should not be in the tournament, period. And furthermore, if you win your conference tournament, I hate that they make some 16 seeds play in the play-in games. They won their conference tournament. Let them play a 1 seed. Give them a shot at Virginia or Gonzaga, right? Don't make them play Mount St. Mary's or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous. Put them into the tournament. Let those 8 teams be the best of the mid-majors that didn't win their conference tournaments, right? Give me the Belmont. Give me the Lipscomb. Give me, like, if Davidson loses, you know, their conference tournament, right? Give me teams like this. I mean, like, that's where the real intrigue, that's where the heart of the sport is. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
That would be a true play-in scenario there.
Give me Toledo. Like, God bless, you know, just make it happen.
We'll shift over to a conference that was pretty competitive as well, and that's the Big 12. As you stated earlier, Kansas did not win the conference or share the conference title this year. Kansas State and Texas Tech, they shared the top spot, with Kansas coming in 3rd and Baylor rounding out the top 4 seeds in this year's Big 12 tournament. Baylor is actually playing as we are recording this right now. So your choices, or your choice rather, for the winner of this weekend's Big 12 tournament is?
This is actually probably the easiest one to pick. I'm going to pick Texas Tech. I don't think there's much of a choice here. Kansas has been quietly bad the last few weeks. They've really fallen apart. Kansas State is not going to have Dean Wade. We've seen what a giant difference that makes on this team. That really clears an easy path for Texas Tech. I actually sort of don't expect Kansas to survive today. I think they'll probably lose to Texas, a really desperate Texas team versus a Kansas team that just seems to have really punted this season away. They know they're like the losers in the history of the last 2 decades of Kansas, and they're not wearing that well. Texas Tech is going to beat the hell out of West Virginia today. I think they can easily beat the winner of Kansas-Texas. And then Kansas State, I think, would fall. I saw that Iowa State is beating Baylor right now. Iowa State is another team that I think is a sleeper, period. They've got so much talent. Now, they've had some consistency issues, no question. They've really sort of limped across the finish line. I would have liked to have seen them put up more of a challenge against Texas Tech at home in the last game of the season. But, I mean, you're talking about and frankly, I think if I recall correctly, Shayok missed at least one of those games. He missed the West Virginia game, so that's obviously why that one didn't go down the way it went. But, like, Nick Weiler-Babb, Talon Horton-Tucker, Shayok, Wigginton, who didn't play a lot early this year, Cameron Lard, who has actually gotten like inconsistent minutes. I don't really know what's going on with him. I'd have to look into that. And then Tyrese Halliburton, who's really come on, been one of the most impressive freshmen in the country. I mean, you're looking at an Iowa State team that's got potentially like 5 future NBA players on that roster. I mean, they are deep, 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 and they're really young on the whole. So I sort of like it to be Texas Tech, Iowa State in the Big 12 title game. But again, you've got to give it up to Texas Tech there. Chris Beard is my coach of the year. He's a phenomenal young coach. I think UCLA would be foolish to not offer him like $4 million a year and try to steal him. He's probably the best young coach in the country. And Jarrett Culver has really come on. I mean, like they play defense so well. Sometimes they get a little stagnant offensively, but like Chris Beard just draws up great stuff. Great X's and O's guy, great motivator. I think Texas Tech is right on the outside of who I would consider a title contender, but like Texas Tech is probably a pretty good sneaky Final Four pick for a person who wants to sort of go outside of the beaten path a little bit.
Now, I saw reports that the Big 12 may get 8 teams in the tournament this year. That would be the most of any conference. So who do you see as legitimate in and who doesn't have a case?
I mean, yeah, they could get 8. I mean, like ACC could get 8 if NC State can beat Virginia and then Clemson somehow gets a gift. So they're in play for that as well, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh no, ACC would get 9 if Clemson got in and NC State got in. So I think ACC will get 8. Because I think somehow one of those teams is going to slide in, despite my ranting about it. Texas Tech, Kansas State, Iowa State, all safely in. Yeah, I don't know, man. Did I skip one? No, I don't know how they get 8. Who's the 8th? I guess if Texas wins today, which I sort of expect them to, then maybe they get in also. I think TCU is in well, no, they won their game yesterday. I forgot that they won at the last second. I was ready to say that they were out. Oklahoma, I think, is probably in, but they're really going to sweat, dude. Like, there are multiple teams in the Big 12 that are really, really, really going to sweat down the stretch. Again, Texas, God, even if you got to beat Kansas because they're potentially a 16-loss team. That should be grounds for removal from the Big 12 period. Being a 16, God bless America. How do you lose 16 and then you might get in the tournament? I don't even know if they beat Kansas, that's enough, frankly. Like there's an eyeball test that's really hard to get past at the end of the day. I know Texas beat UNC. I know that they've got big wins on their resume. They've obviously beaten Kansas before this year, might beat Kansas again, beat Kansas State on the road, beat Purdue at home. Now that I'm looking at it, those are really good wins. But like, you got so many losses. They got the shit beat out of them. Am I allowed to swear?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I should have asked. They got the shit beat out of them by TCU the last game of the season at home. How do you lose to TCU at home? It's ridiculous. I don't care whether Kerwin Roach is playing or not. Like, you got to beat TCU. So, I don't know, man. Gun to head, I think Oklahoma probably gets in. The end of that game was heartbreaking, though. Did you see that yesterday?
No, I missed it.
They made the shot to send the game to overtime, but then upon replay, you saw that like at the very last second in the shooting motion, the shooter's toe just barely hit the 3-point line, so it was a 2 instead of a 3. And so, yeah, thrill of victory, agony, defeat right there.
The old Ray King 3-pointer, huh?
Yeah, right.
Always on the line.
Oklahoma and TCU gun to head, I'd say, are probably in. I think, is Baylor even in the conversation? They can't be. Yeah, I guess they are in the conversation. Oh, I missed them. Yeah, maybe they will get 8. Baylor's in. But the problem is just like, who do you replace these teams with? Because all the other teams, like, you've got to believe that mid-majors are getting in as at-large teams if these guys are not getting in. If teams like TCU are losing out, if teams like Arizona State in the Pac-12 are not getting in, if teams like Ohio State, Clemson, Minnesota, Oklahoma, if you think these teams are missing, then that means you believe that Belmont's getting in, that Lipscomb is getting in. Teams that, again, I believe should get in, but I just don't necessarily see happening just because I've watched the committee pass those mid-major teams year in and year out over and over and over again. So, yeah, some terrible teams are going to get in. Oklahoma, TCU, sure. Texas, maybe. Indiana, why not? Let's put a 17-loss team in there. Why not? Why stop it there, right? Let's put a sub 500 team as an at-large in the NCAA tournament. Yeah, I don't know, man. This is just, it's rough, and it'd be so easily solved. Put more mid-majors in. The mid-majors are good. They're good. They've earned it. Teams won't play them in out-of-conference play because they know the mid-majors will beat them, so they refuse to play those teams. And then it hurts the resume of these mid-major teams that are just looking to bump up their strength of schedule and can't do it because teams are saying, nah, I'm not playing you, the end.
Mm-hmm.
So
win your conference tournament, and maybe you'll catch us in the big tournament, and where we can't wiggle out of it. But if I got a choice, no, I'm not going to go play Murray State. Are you crazy?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So anyway, yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll all get in. Right. They might all get in. It's ridiculous.
So our final conference tournament will be the guys out west in the Pac-12, where Washington is the top seed, followed by Arizona State.
Oh, Utah, man, we're gonna talk about the Pac-12
and Oregon State. Hey, man, they're a major conference. They're gonna get an automatic bid. And when
Big East tournament Big East is better than the Pac-12 by a lot.
If you want to substitute,
well, here's my Pac-12 thoughts. Washington is gonna win the Pac-12 tournament. Everyone else sucks.
It's going to stay at home.
They're all terrible. They're all terrible. Arizona State maybe has a chance to get into the NCAA tournament, but they could also lose to like Washington State or whatever. Like they are so all over the map. Bobby Hurley, not a contender for the Duke job, in my opinion. Yeah, nobody deserves to get in other than Washington. And even Washington should only really deserve to get in as the automatic qualifier. If you lose to California, then you deserve to not be in the NCAA tournament. California, until they beat Washington, was the worst major conference team in the Ken Pom era. So, like, in the last 2 decades, Cal was the worst, and they strolled into Washington and won. Like, that should be a disqualifier automatically. Yeah, so the Pac-12 is awful, and they're not worth talking about, in my opinion.
So over in the Big East, I don't know. I don't have those teams in front of me, but I know it would be in some combination: Villanova, Seton Hall, Marquette, and maybe Georgetown as their 4 top teams.
Here, I'm pulling up the bracket right now. This should be pretty easy to find. I mean, I think you're more or less on the mark there. Yeah, Villanova, Marquette, Seton Hall, and Xavier.
Okay.
Are the top 4 with Creighton and Georgetown closely behind. This is actually going to be a really interesting one. This one's going to be good. I don't know who's winning out of Villanova and Providence right now. Again, it's an easy one for me to look up. I've got the app open in front of me. Oh, so Villanova's winning, sort of as expected. I really like, and maybe this is just like K-Bad, like influencing me a little bit. I like how Georgetown has played down the stretch. I think they've really come on. They're a very young team, and they have looked a lot better as of late than they did earlier in the year. So I feel like they're probably. I mean, this is probably not just me saying this. I think they're a pretty sneaky pick if you're looking for like a sleeper. They've struggled against Seton Hall a little bit, and that's who they'd have to play. But I kind of like their chances. I feel like they've played pretty well recently. And again, they've got a great backcourt, which I feel like you really need. I mean, they just beat Marquette on the road, beat Seton Hall, beat Villanova. I mean, they did get blown out by DePaul, but let's ignore that. Yeah, it's just hard to pick somebody other than Villanova, in my opinion, here. Even with Villanova not being great this year, I mean, so it is pretty wide open. Marquette is so one-player reliant. Now, granted, if it wasn't for Zion Williamson, he would be the player of the year, Marcus Howard. But they're so reliant on him to get like 30 to 40 points. I mean, they've done really well this year on the whole that way. So maybe I shouldn't discount it because, again, guard play matters. He's certainly better than the guards they have at Villanova, but Marquette would also they'd have to beat St. John's. They'd have to beat either Seton Hall or Georgetown, both of whom I think would be pretty difficult, especially Georgetown just beat Marquette. And then they'd have to beat, realistically, probably Villanova. I mean, that's a tough path. I feel like if you're betting, you've really got to go with Villanova, assuming that they're going to be the team to beat here. Yeah, I mean, but Marquette's probably going to get a bigger seed than Villanova in the NCAA tournament. So, I mean, maybe I'm just underrating them because, again, Wojo is a candidate for the Duke job, and I do not want him to get the job. Like, I think that next year, first 10 games, if you're a gambler, fade Marquette against the spread in every game next year at the beginning of the year before people realize that they will not be remotely as good without Marcus Howard.
So before we move on to talk about the mid-majors and the number one seeds for the tournament next year, if you were on the committee, what would be your cutoff for losses for a tournament team?
Oh, man. I mean, so see, the problem is exactly what I just said with Texas, right? Like, they've got wins versus Kansas, Kansas State, Purdue, UNC. I mean, like, that's a really hefty top four. And ultimately in the tournament, you want the best teams. And, now I'm going to completely row back on what I just said, but like the best teams, like your record doesn't necessarily reflect how good you are as a team, right? Like Texas is 27th in KenPom. They're higher than Marquette in KenPom, and Marquette's going to be a 5 seed, right? So like Texas as a 12 seed, if they were to get in, as a play-in team or whatever, would be favored against Marquette, the 5 seed, in the opening round, right? Like, that's crazy to think about, but that just goes to underscore the point that records don't really matter when it comes to determining how good your team is. And even though they want the records to matter for seeding, I think ultimately the NCAA committee wants the best teams in, which is why they end up having a team with what will end up being 16 losses, Texas, be in over a team like Lipscomb, who I think is great, but who is 51st in KenPom, or Belmont, who is 54th in KenPom. It just comes down to what you believe they want. Do they want the best teams, or do they want to reward the teams that play the most consistently and display the most heart? Now, I would prefer the latter, but I get the argument for the former. I mean, like, yeah, Lipscomb is less likely to beat Marquette than Texas is in a 5-12 matchup. So would I have a cutoff? I don't know. If you can beat tournament teams with some degree of consistency, and then the mid majors, who granted the system is rigged against, but if they haven't really displayed the ability to beat a major conference team, I mean, Lipscomb beat TCU on the road. That's it, right? They got swept by Belmont. They put up a hell of a fight against Louisville. Like, but and so like that does matter, but like I don't know, especially because I was at Louisville. I wouldn't put a cutoff. I know I just like bitched about it, but I wouldn't put a cutoff because I think ultimately, like if you're a team with a lot of losses, but you're like a top 25 team via KenPom, then you probably need to be in the tournament because you're going to cause some real chaos. Like Texas, realistically, yeah, they could lose in the first four, but if they made the Elite Eight, it wouldn't really surprise anybody because they're good enough to beat the best teams.
Right.
When they're playing well, which is infrequently. But yeah, I don't know. That's such a tough question. I don't have an answer to it, sadly.
We'll shift over to thinking about next week as the NCAA tournament will start. And like you've been talking about, it's all about the upsets in the first weekend of the tournament. So the mid-majors are going to play a big factor in those upsets. So give us a handful of mid-majors that we need to watch out for next week.
I mean, this one's going to be a no-brainer. I mean, especially because you as a UNC fan are familiar with this team. I mean, Wofford is probably going to be a 7 seed right around there. That's a team that's really tempting to take into the Sweet 16, to upset a 2 seed and to move on from there. They're really good and they shoot lights out. They've got, realistically 2 players that might not make the NBA, but are going to at least play professional basketball and might give the NBA a chance. And that's definitely something that you look for in your mid-major sort of Cinderella teams. You really want to find somebody that's got some real talent there, right? And Wofford definitely has that talent. Buffalo is tremendously talented. Again, that's barely going to be an upset kind of scenario, but Buffalo's like the team where they're going to get like a 6 seed, maybe a 7 seed. And then again, I think they could easily beat a 2 seed or a 3 seed. Buffalo, screams an Elite Eight team to me, if you want to find an upset candidate like that. I mean, to put it in perspective, Wofford is going to be like a 7 seed, and the KenPom has them at the strength of maybe a 5 seed. So you always want to sort of look for those teams that are underseeded from what their difficulty is. Because then, I mean, again, if Wofford is playing a 2 seed, like let's say LSU somehow gets a 2 seed, well, that's going to be a pick'em game in Vegas. Like Wofford and LSU are basically the same in terms of how well they've been playing. So, yeah, I mean, like if you've got a 7 seed you could favor over 2 seed, great. Like that makes your life a lot easier. In terms as a gambler, you always want to pick the Cinderella guy there. Other teams that are mid-majors that I like, I'm not high on Nevada, actually. They just don't play defense and they take terrible shots. I'm really tempted to size UCF here, a little Johnny Dawkins action. I think they've played really well. I think his son has played really well. And they've also got like Taco Fall in the middle, which if those listening have not watched him play, he's 7'6", he's 310 pounds. He's just a game changer because he's so big. Like, and he moves okay, and he's like a pretty smart player for a guy who's that big. Like, he's not just like the kid in high school who was big but like bad, but you played him anyway because he was so big. Right? Like he's actually good too. He has a huge block rate, obviously, scores like 10, 11 points a game, obviously mostly just on putbacks. But that makes it really, really hard to plan for that team because you can't like practice playing against a guy who's 7'6". There's no way to account for it. So that'd be an interesting one. I think Utah State is good. They would probably be, I don't know, around the 10 line, 11 line, which is probably appropriate, frankly. But I sort of like them more than Nevada in a lot of ways. They've got some pretty decent wins this year, beating Nevada. They gave Houston a game at Houston. They beat St. Mary's. Again, no like hugely impressive wins there. Just a really smart team. They defensive rebound. Like you're not going to get offensive rebounds against Utah State. They take care of the ball. They shoot the ball well. They move the ball beautifully. Top 10 in the country in assist rate. So that's the sort of thing that really helps. They got good experienced guard play there. Any like real sleepers? People are going to talk about Murray State a lot. And again, they've got a guard in John Morant who can take over a game single-handedly, I would check which 5 seed they're playing. If they're playing like a strong 5 seed, I think that's one that everyone is gonna like gravitate toward. Same with St. Mary. I think that those are gonna be really popular picks that I'm just maybe not necessarily completely on board with. St. Mary's actually probably is a pretty good one, but Murray State's like 52nd in KenPom. I'm not convinced they're even better than Belmont, even though they beat Belmont. So yeah, not overly in love with that. If you're looking for a team that's a mid-major that you want to pick as an upset special, again, I can't recommend KenPom's website enough. I'm a subscriber. It's easily worth the $20 a year. I'm on the website literally every day, basically. Look for teams that are higher than like the rest of them. Like, so every year you can go in and see like a 13 seed that is better than some of the 12 seed teams, or a 15 that's better than some of the 13s, right? Like you want to find those discrepancies, right? Because if you're a 2 seed and you're playing a true 15 seed, then you're probably in pretty good shape. But if you're a weak 2 seed and you're playing the equivalent of a 13 seed, that makes a world of difference. That's going to be a game that's multiple possessions closer than it would be the other way around. So that's where I would look. Teams like Northeastern, who will probably be on the 14-15 line, they sort of jump out to me as a potential candidate there. Maybe they'll be more like a 13. I might be underrating them. Yale obviously plays really well. They've got, a pro prospect on their team, so that's certainly one that one could look for. I don't know about any like deep cuts though. I mean, Colgate was okay. I'm trying to find like the next 16 seed. You know what I mean? Like, there's always you want to be that guy. You want to be that guy who had it in your bracket, and then you can show your friends and really blow their mind. I'm just not convinced that any of the 16 seed teams are good enough this year that they play like a wild enough like style, something interesting enough. I mean, Iona will be a 16 seed. I don't think they've been very good this year. They don't play defense really. But they never have. But Iona is one of those teams that just like they shoot a lot. A lot. This year they're not as good at shooting, but I mean they've won the last 9-10 games, whatever. Maybe they're feeling it a little bit more now. Yeah. I don't know. I don't see a 16. People say like, oh, now the doors are off. Now 16 seeds will whatever. No, it's not going to happen like that. Last year was wild. Last year was just weird, and that's that. Yeah, and NC State's going to lose today, so I don't. To follow up on that, I don't think NC State's going anywhere. Yeah, look for like a 12 seed, maybe a 13, but look for those ones that are underrated on KenPom. I think that tends to be something that looks really good. And then find the teams that are weak at the top. That's where you really want to look, right? For teams that are not quite as strong on those top lines. Now, I think that the number 1 seeds, regardless of who you have them as, they're probably in pretty good shape. Because they're all like the best teams, period. But then you look at like, again, certainly LSU as a 2 or a 3 seed, they're not as good as a 3 seed according to KenPom. They should be more like a 5 seed. So that's regardless of Will Wade. So that's obviously a team you can look at for an upset. Certainly, I would peg Kansas as being very, very vulnerable to an opening round upset. Kansas State even more so if Dean Wade isn't playing. I think Virginia Tech is underrated as a 5 seed. I think Maryland is probably a vulnerable 5 seed. Mississippi State, Marquette, both definitely, especially Marquette, very vulnerable 5 seeds. If we got Marquette versus Murray State, I'm picking Murray State in a heartbeat. I'm not thinking twice about it. So yeah, those 5 seeds are vulnerable this year, man. Mm-hmm. I hadn't even considered it. But yeah, look for those discrepancies, and same for like I think less likely than big Cinderellas. You want to pick like some teams in like the 6 through 8 range to really go far. And again, I sort of talked about I think Auburn is a team that could go really far in there. I think Buffalo is a team that is underrated in that area. I think that Iowa State is probably going to be seated below where they belong. I could certainly argue that Louisville will be seated under where they belong. They'll be a 7 or 8 seed. Again, via KenPom, they should probably be closer to like a 4 seed. I mean, that's ridiculous. So yeah, you want to look for teams like that. Those are like the real quote unquote sleepers. Teams that we know can beat 2 seeds and 1 seeds, make Final Four runs. Unexpected, but yeah. Anyway. That's how you should pick your bracket. Long rant over.
And our final topic will be just who do you think are going to be the number 1 seeds when the tournament is announced on Sunday? We can pretty much Sharpie in Virginia in the East, as they've basically gone wire to wire in the ACC. Unless they just have a total just blowout loss in the ACC tournament, I don't see them moving off of their line. And even though I
can see them moving off the East. I don't see them moving off the one line. I agree that they're a 1 seed. Maybe if they lost to State today, but that's not going to happen.
And then the other number 1 seed that everybody feels strongly about is out west with Gonzaga. Even though they got upset in their conference tournament, everybody still feels like they're going to represent the Western region as their number 1 seed. So that leaves the South and the Midwest kind of up for grabs this weekend. A lot of people still have Duke as representing the South, but I think they're going to, after the Carolina loss on Saturday, a lot of people are trying to nudge Carolina up there to maybe take over Kentucky's spot in the Midwest, or maybe even take over Duke in the South. But it's all going to, I think, hinge on who wins that game on Friday if they play each other. So in your estimation, who has the inside track on the 2 other number 1 seeds that are up for grabs?
Well, first of all, I want to also point out that Gonzaga might be vulnerable if both Duke and Michigan State win their conference tournaments. Because I think if both of them win their conference tournaments, then you really can't take either of them off the 1 line. So then you'd have Virginia, you'd have Duke, you'd have Michigan State, and then are you going to pick Kentucky or Gonzaga? I mean, again, if Kentucky wins the SEC tournament, if Tennessee wins the SEC tournament, and especially if it's Kentucky, then I think that's a 1 seed resume as well, right? So I think Gonzaga is rooting for teams like Duke, like Michigan State, like Kentucky to lose just to make their lives a little easier. I agree that they have an inside track, but yeah, that would be tough. I think that if Duke beats UNC, they're on the 1 line. And again, this has less to do with what is maybe even fair. And it has more to do with the fact that the NCAA wants the best teams in the field in the best way. And I think it would be weird if the Vegas favorite to win it all, which if Zion is playing, Duke will be the Vegas favorite to win the NCAA tournament. I think it would be very weird if they were a 2 seed. I don't know that the NCAA would do that. So I think as long as Duke gets up to Virginia in the ACC tournament, then I think they're probably a 1 seed. I think if UNC beats Duke, they're definitely a 1 seed. I think I think the winner of Duke UNC on Friday is definitely a 1 seed and still has maybe an outside chance of getting the other 1 seed if Kentucky and Michigan State lose. I think you've really got to root for chaos in that scenario. Now, granted, I'm placing bets on UNC and Kentucky and Michigan State to win games all the way through, just so if they keep winning and I'm miserable, then I keep winning money. It's the old emotional hedge, right? Which is a standard Russell play. I think if you put a gun to my head, I think Duke will beat UNC with a healthy Zion, assuming that he's 100%, which I think is a safe assumption. Then I think Virginia is in. I think that Duke is in. I still think that Gonzaga is in. And then if Kentucky wins the SEC tournament, like I think that they will, I'd have to think that they are the fourth. And if Kentucky lost, then it would be down to UNC and Michigan State as the other one. And that's a really interesting conversation to have, especially because in order to make the argument that Duke is like an unimpeachable 1 seed, then you're almost certainly including the fact that Duke has had injury issues. Well, Michigan State has had a ton of injury issues, and they still won their conference. So, Duke right now, just for context to people, why I also think that Duke will probably be 1 seed. In the net, they're 3. They're 3rd in the net. UNC is 7th, Michigan State 8th, Kentucky 5th. Even with the problems Duke has had, they're 15-5 against quads 1 and 2. To put that in perspective, Kentucky and UNC are both 16-5. Michigan State is 16-6. So they're really, really close. And then if you look at just what the best wins are, I think there's basically no contest that Duke has the best wins of all of these teams. I mean, UNC's got the win at Duke, certainly. Duke has a season sweep of the number 1 overall seed, Virginia. Duke has neutral court win versus Texas Tech, and Duke has an absolute beatdown of Kentucky. I mean, like that's 4 massive wins against teams that are realistically going to be 1 and 2 seeds. So I think it's really going to be hard to keep them off the top line for that, as long as Duke doesn't give them a reason to knock them down. But between UNC and Michigan State, I mean, I'd have to look and see who has the best wins. I mean, UNC's regular season sweep of Duke may give them that nudge. But, I mean, if Michigan State wins the Big Ten tournament, it's just going to be too hard to keep them out, because they love if you can win your conference and your conference tournament. They just love that way too much. So gun to head on the 4th one, if Kentucky loses, which again I don't think that they will, if Kentucky loses, if Michigan State wins the Big Ten tournament, I think Michigan State would be the 4th. If Michigan State loses the Big Ten tournament, I think that UNC would be the 4th. So UNC fans need to be rooting for, obviously, first and foremost, a win over Duke. That goes without saying. I don't think I need to tell UNC fans that. But if they lose that game, then they just need to be rooting for Kentucky and Michigan State to lose, because there's still a path to the 1 seed with that in mind.
John Swofford would be popping his ACC shirt if they got 3 number 1 seeds, boy.
Yeah, I mean, but it's merited. I mean, like Michigan State's best wins are they have a season sweep of Michigan. They've got a win over Purdue. And that's it. I mean, like they don't have another really sexy win beyond that. UNC's got the Gonzaga win, and they've got a season sweep of Duke. I mean, like that's a huge, huge advantage in my opinion. Now, granted, UNC like got the brakes beat off them by Michigan, but like single games don't really matter like that. We've seen over and over again the committee prefers big wins.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Big wins always matter. Now, Kentucky's got big wins. Kentucky's got UNC. They've got the big win over Tennessee. They've got a big win at Louisville. They've got a win at Auburn. They got the win versus Kansas. Back when I believe Kansas, at least, well, they weren't full strength. Doak was out, but I mean, those are some big wins, right? Tennessee's got big wins. They beat Gonzaga. They beat Louisville neutral court. They obviously beat the brakes off of Kentucky. They've got big wins, right? But like the biggest wins there are, but I think that UNC's got an argument that the win over Gonzaga by double figures and the season sweep of Duke, in terms of best wins, that's as high as it gets, right? And then Duke, they've got the Kentucky, the Texas Tech, season sweep of Virginia. They've got Louisville on the road in very impressive fashion. They've got Auburn. They've got FSU on the road. I mean, like, that's why when you look at just the quadrants, like I don't think they look at just quadrant record when you're trying to choose a 1 seed. You're also looking at best wins, which is how in the past Duke has made number 1 seeds even when people think that they shouldn't get a 1 seed, because Duke tends to just have like really impressive big wins. They'll always drop a bullshit game, right? So will UNC, right? Like, yeah, these teams lose bullshit games, but like if you win big games on big national stages that people watch and you've got names on your team that people recognize, the committee wants to reward those teams. They just do. Why relegate one of your big teams? It just doesn't make sense to me. And again, like I don't think this would matter, but if it came down to, like, let's say Michigan State lost and it came down to UNC and Kentucky, UNC would be favored neutral court over Kentucky. Even though Kentucky beat UNC earlier this year, UNC would probably be about a point or two favorite over Kentucky right today. So I don't know how, again, that influences, but it certainly seems to have in the past, unless you're like a double conference winner or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it'll be really interesting. I think we won't know anything today. I mean, unless like one of these teams loses, and then obviously they're not going to be a 1 seed. If UNC loses, they're out. If Duke loses, they're out. Kentucky doesn't play today. Tennessee doesn't play today. Michigan State doesn't play today. So like tomorrow we'll learn a lot more. I think we'll learn which of Duke and UNC will be in. And then from there, it's just Kentucky watch, Michigan State watch. I guess Tennessee is an outside shot. But again, I think it would require chaos. I think it would require, for Tennessee to get in, Duke would have to lose. UNC would have to lose to Virginia, obviously. Kentucky and Michigan State both lose, and Tennessee wins the SEC tournament. I think if all those things happen, people would really consider Tennessee as a 1 seed. But I don't. That's a lot to happen. Yeah, and I mean those are my. By the way, those are my title contenders too, for the most part. Virginia, Gonzaga, Duke, UNC, Kentucky. Those are, I think, the big five. I think Tennessee you've got to consider. That's 6. I honestly think Michigan is better than Michigan State. I know that like the resumes don't say that. I know that the KenPom doesn't say that. I think Michigan is just more balanced than Michigan State is. And I trust Beilein over Izzo in March. I think Michigan is sort of a quasi-sleeper title contender, and I think Texas Tech is a quasi-sleeper title contender. I don't really consider Michigan State a title contender, famous last words. But yeah, those would be like my 8 teams. If you don't have one of those teams winning it all, then you're throwing a Hail Mary, I think.
All right, folks. So there you have it. The top 8 teams you need to be looking out for next week when you start filling out your brackets to go far. Some teams that you need to look for to also cause some chaos and cause havoc in your bracket. You have those as well. And also along with the winners of this weekend's tournaments. So I'd like to, at this point, give Russ an opportunity to give his shout outs, let people know where they can follow you on the net, where they can hopefully next week get a chance to listen to you and K-Bads talk about the brackets and break down the full tournament once we know where everybody's going and who they're matched up against.
I'm going to see if K-Bad wants to do like a live show. I feel like that'd be kind of fun. Yeah, I'm at Russell H. Film on Twitter for just like my regular Twitter. At Seconds, the number 2 Madness is where I tweet about college basketball. So you can check that out. Again, there's our podcast, 2.1 Seconds to Madness. I think we've only released like 1 episode this year at most. Yeah, hopefully we'll be back next year, maybe. I'd like to. I miss it. It's just that life has been crazy this year. Also, my website, thebeertravelguide.com, if you like beer and drinking beer when you're on vacation and you don't really know where the best beer is wherever you're going, thebeertravelguide.com is here to help. We've got the top-rated breweries in a bunch of major cities and areas, ranked sort of by their Untappd rating, what their hours are, whether they have food, lots of information for you. We're also doing like write-ups about the places that we've been and sort of the best brewery hops where you can just like plan on hitting 2 or 3 in a row. And we put a lot more detail into those. We've also got an event calendar for beer events nationwide that we're sort of continuing to try to develop. So if you like craft beer, you like supporting local brewers, then our website is sort of designed to really help you find everything that you're looking for. So thebeertravelguide.com, and you can follow us on Facebook. Please do. The Beer Travel Guide. We post all our new stuff there. Instagram, The Beer Travel Guide, twitter.com/beertravelbtg. And then on Instagram, I'm Russell H. Beer. So you can follow me there and see what I've been drinking. Again, if you're a craft beer person, I've almost always every day got some new picture of craft beer up. So, there's that going for you too, which is nice. One more thing to add about the 1 seeds that I forgot to mention. I think that another argument for the ACC getting 3 in is, out of all of the potential 1 seeds, Duke and UNC have by far the hardest non-conference strength of schedule. UNC and Duke are both in the 30s. Michigan State is in the 90s. Kentucky is in the hundreds. Tennessee, like in the 120s. Virginia, I mean, they're already locked in. Gonzaga's in the 100s. Virginia's non-conference was terrible. It was in like the mid 200s. But so I think that might be something that would play a role as well. If Duke and UNC have the best big wins of this bunch and they have the hardest non-conference strength of schedules, that's going to be really hard to ignore, I think. But anyway, Russell H. Beer, the Beer Travel Guide, seconds to number 2 madness. I think that's all my stuff I needed to plug.
Well, Russ, I just want to give you a shout out and tell you that I've enjoyed your podcast. I think you and K-Bad have the best college basketball podcast in the country. Like you guys say, you guys watch a lot of games, and you guys turn me on to players that I would never even consider looking at or staying up to watch or checking out this specific team. But due to your extensive knowledge and K-Bad's knowledge and how many games you guys have watched over the years, definitely have turned me on to a lot of teams and players that help me fill out my brackets during the tournament. So I just want to thank you guys for all the efforts and hard work you guys have put in over the years at Seconds to Madness. And I hope to hear from you guys really, really soon. So just a big shout out to you and K-Bads, for all the work that y'all put in and going forward. And
follow K-Bad also on Twitter at KBADDS. He's been tweeting a little less frequently about college basketball, but again, he's a really smart dude, my co-host for the show. Definitely worth a follow as well.
Right. So for my special guest, Russell Hainline, I'm Don Delarente, and now you know the score. Thanks, Russ. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, man, no problem.